The letter arrived at 7 minutes past 6 in the evening, Washington time. It was not an email, it was not a text, it was not a social media post designed for the algorithmic maw. It was a single cream-colored sheet of heavy bond paper, folded once, sealed with wax the color of dried blood, and delivered by a Marine Corps lieutenant colonel in full-dress blues who stood at perfect, silent attention in the West Wing lobby until the White House usher signed for it. The seal bore no presidential mark. It bore the personal crest of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. That is how you know in this town that the night will be long. For the last hour, I have been watching the feeds from the Situation Room. Not the official feed, not the press pool feed. Those don't exist yet. I have been watching the secondary feeds, the logistical shadows. The Air Force has just placed 2 E-4B Night Watch aircraft on a ground alert status not seen since the early hours of October 7, 2023. These are the doomsday planes, the ones that cost $240,000 an hour to fly. The ones that exist so that if the Capitol is vaporized, someone still gets to decide what happens next. They don't warm up the engines for diplomatic receptions. They don't scramble for trade disputes. They scramble for one reason and one reason only. The people who know what is coming are already preparing for the silence. We need to talk about what the chairman's letter contained. But before we do, we need to talk about the man who wrote it. General Marcus Hollister is not a politician. He is a 4-star general who spent 27 months in command of Joint Special Operations Command. He does not exaggerate. He does not posture. He does not send letters to the White House to express mild concern about budgetary allocations or force structure reviews. When Marcus Hollister breaks out the wax seal and the dress blues, he is telling the commander-in-chief that the Republic is standing at the edge of a very high cliff and the wind is picking up. Tonight, that wind is a gale. The context you are missing, the context the networks are desperately trying to assemble in their off-camera bullpens right now, is not about a single event. It is about a cascade. For 17 days, we have watched the slow-motion collision of 3 tectonic forces. Force number 1, the collapse of the informal ceasefire in the Bakhmut salient, where Russian irregulars have been probing Ukrainian forward operating bases with a ferocity unseen since the siege. Force number 2, the emergency session of the UN Security Council, called by the French, which broke up in acrimony at 4 this morning. Force number 3, the frantic shuttling of the Secretary of State between Riyadh and Tel Aviv. That is the surface. Beneath it, the magma is moving. Let me take you inside the Joint Chiefs briefing room, the tank, as it was 12 hours ago. I have spoken to a source who was in the room, not for attribution, not for quotation, but for the texture of what fear sounds like in a room full of men and women who have spent their lives learning not to show it. The Director of National Intelligence placed a folder on the table. It was black. It had no classification marking on the cover, which is in itself a classification marking. The DNI said, and I am paraphrasing as closely as my source's memory allows, "We have high confidence, based on signals, intelligence, and human assets, that the Kremlin has authorized the deployment of tactical nuclear delivery systems to a forward staging area in Belarus." That is the moment the temperature in the room dropped below freezing. Tactical nuclear weapons are not the apocalypse. They are smaller, they are battlefield weapons, they are designed to break a conventional stalemate and shatter an enemy's will to fight. But here is the thing about that word, tactical. It is a lie we tell ourselves to make the unthinkable thinkable. Once the nuclear threshold is crossed, there is no clean boundary, there is no polite agreement that the mushroom cloud stays inside its lane. Once you uncork that bottle, you do not get to decide how much of the poison you drink. Now we have to talk about President Elizabeth Warner and the box she has been placed inside. President Warner is a former 3-term senator from Colorado, a woman who built her reputation on the granular mastery of intelligence oversight. She knows the names of the station chiefs. She knows the difference between a hypersonic glide vehicle and a depressed trajectory submarine-launched ballistic missile. She knows, better than almost any commander-in-chief in recent memory, exactly how close the doomsday clock is set to midnight. And tonight, at 21 minutes past the hour, she convened a meeting of the full National Security Council. Not the Principals Committee, not a Deputies Committee, the full table, every chair filled, every voice heard, every silence pregnant with dread. What was discussed in that room is at this moment the most closely guarded secret in the Western Hemisphere, but we know who was in the room and we know how long they stayed. The Secretary of Defense arrived at 6:53 p.m., the Vice President arrived at 6:57. The national security advisor was already there, her hair still wet from a hastily abandoned dinner party in Georgetown. The chairman arrived at 7:01 carrying the letter. The Secretary of State was on a video link from a secure room at the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh, where the ambient temperature outside was 68 degrees, but the air inside was frozen solid. When the Secretary of State asked for a private line to the White House, hotel managers learned to look the other way. Let's pause here and talk about the Russian calculus, because the Russians are not insane. They are not run by cartoon villains who twirl mustaches and cackle about world domination. They are run by pragmatists, brutal, risk-tolerant pragmatists who have spent 3 years watching the West's resolve waver. They have watched the supplemental funding bills stall in the House. They have watched the European allies haggle over artillery shell production. They have watched the American electorate signal through polling and through primaries, a profound exhaustion with the endless cost of a war 8 time zones away. And so in the Kremlin's cold calculus, this is not an act of madness. It is a stress test. They are pushing on the structure to see where it breaks. But here's the variable the Kremlin may have miscalculated. President Warner spent 4 years on the Senate Intelligence Committee. She sat through briefings on the Cuban Missile Crisis that were still classified until 2021. She has read the transcripts of ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council that John F. Kennedy convened in October 1962. She knows that Kennedy's greatest fear was not the Soviet missiles in Cuba. It was the momentum of his own military. He was terrified that the generals, with their briefing charts and their target lists, would push him into a war nobody wanted. And so he slowed everything down. He created friction. He demanded proof. He forced the process to inhale. Tonight, in the Situation Room, Elizabeth Warner is channeling that ghost. I have a source, and I want to be very careful here, who has seen a fragment of the chairman's letter. It is not a long document. It is, by all accounts, 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph is an assessment of military readiness. The second paragraph is a summary of the intelligence regarding the Russian deployment. The third paragraph, the one that matters, is the chairman's professional military advice. It is, I am told, 4 sentences long. The second sentence contains the phrase, irreducible minimum. The third sentence contains the phrase, escalation dominance. The fourth sentence contains no jargon at all. It is plain English. It is the kind of English you use when you are sitting at a kitchen table telling someone you love something they do not want to hear. Now we have to consider the diplomatic chessboard, which is suddenly very crowded. The British Prime Minister has canceled his scheduled address to the CBI. The French president has cut short his dinner with the German chancellor. The phone lines between Washington and London, between London and Paris, between Paris and Berlin are incandescent with traffic. This is the machinery of the alliance, the NATO consultation process that has been refined over 77 years of existential threat. But here is the uncomfortable truth about alliances. They are only as strong as the weakest nerve in the room. And tonight in capitals across Europe, nerves are being tested as they have not been tested since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Let me tell you about the E-4B Night Watch, because the symbolism matters as much as the capability. These are the aircraft that are designed to look like ordinary Boeing 747s, but are anything but. They have electromagnetic pulse shielding. They have a refueling receptacle that allows them to stay airborne for days. They have a conference room, a briefing room, and a direct satellite link to every major American military command on the planet. When those engines start turning, it is not a precaution, it is a message. The message is, we are preparing for the possibility that the ground beneath us is no longer safe. That message is received instantly by every signals intelligence station in every hostile capital. The message is intended to be received. Deterrence is a theater, and the curtain is rising. We need to talk about the procedural architecture of a nuclear crisis, because it is not what you see in the movies. There is no single button. There is no football with a red trigger. The actual process is bureaucratic, iterative, and agonizingly deliberate. The President must issue a finding. The Secretary of Defense must concur. The Chairman of the Joint Chiefs must validate the order. The Commander of U.S. Strategic Command must receive the order, authenticate it, and then, and only then, transmit the launch codes. There are checks, balances, and redundancies at every step. They were designed by men who had seen Hiroshima, who had seen Nagasaki, who spent the rest of their lives trying to ensure that no single human being could ever unilaterally end the world. Tonight, those checks and balances are being tested in real time. But here's the complication that keeps the strategists awake at night. The Russian doctrine is different. The Russian command and control system is designed for speed, for pre-delegation, for the assumption that the decision makers at the top may be vaporized in the first exchange. Russian tactical nuclear weapons are held at lower levels of readiness, with shorter authentication chains, with commanders who have been given broader discretion to respond to perceived imminent threats. This asymmetry, our deliberate slowness versus their doctrinal quickness, creates a window of vulnerability. It creates a scenario where we are still deliberating and they are already acting. I want you to understand the geography of fear as it is experienced in the Situation Room. The room itself is not large. It is approximately the size of a moderately upscale law firm's conference room. The walls are covered in light wood paneling that conceals the wiring for the secure communications arrays. There are no windows. There is no natural light. The air is recycled, scrubbed, and maintained at a constant 68 degrees. The room is designed to eliminate all external stimuli, to force the participants to focus entirely on the information flowing across the screens and the voices coming through the speakers. It is a sensory deprivation tank for the most consequential decision-making on Earth. The human element in that room is what the historians will study if there are historians left to study it. President Warner has not raised her voice. That is what the attendees will remember. She has asked questions. She has asked for sources, for confidence levels, for alternative interpretations of the satellite imagery. She has asked the director of the CIA, a man named Robert Kessler, who spent 22 years in the clandestine service, what his instinct tells him. Kessler paused for a very long time before he answered. Instinct, he said, is the luxury of the uninformed. Then he said, but if I had to bet, I would bet they are testing us. The president nodded and the room exhaled. We have to consider the global economic reaction because it is already happening in markets that never close. The offshore trading desks in Singapore and Hong Kong have seen a sudden violent flight to quality. The yield on the 10-year Treasury note has dropped 30 basis points in 2 hours. Gold has spiked through its previous resistance level. Bitcoin, supposedly the currency of the apocalypse, is actually down. Because when the real apocalypse beckons, people want the guarantee of the United States government, not the cryptographic abstraction of a decentralized ledger. The algorithms are reading the headlines. The algorithms are doing what algorithms do. They are pricing in the probability of fire. Now we turn to the role of Congress, which is constitutionally the branch that declares war, but operationally the branch that is always the last to know. The leadership has been notified. The Speaker, the Majority Leader, the chairs and ranking members of the Armed Services and Intelligence Committees have been summoned to a secure briefing at 11 p.m. They will be escorted one by one through the basement tunnel that connects the Capitol to the Library of Congress, and from there to a sensitive compartmented information facility that exists in the architectural plans but not in any public directory. They will be told what the president knows. They will be asked for nothing because there is nothing in this moment that Congress can give. The machinery of Article 1 is ponderous. The machinery of Article 2 is swift. Let's talk about the human cost that is not yet visible in the satellite photos. In Bakhmut, in the trenches where the mud is freezing solid, the Ukrainian soldiers do not need intelligence briefings to know that something has shifted. They can hear it in the radio traffic. They can see it in the absence of Russian logistical convoys that usually resupply at this hour. The Russians are pulling back, not retreating, pulling back. They are creating a buffer. They are clearing the battle space. When an army clears the battle space in the vicinity of its own tactical nuclear delivery systems, it is not planning to advance. It is planning to observe. It is planning to wait for the flash and then advance through the radiation. The Ukrainian president has not yet spoken publicly. His communications director has issued a 3-sentence statement expressing grave concern. That is diplomatic language for, we have been told something we cannot repeat. The Ukrainian ambassador to the United States was summoned to the State Department at 8:15 p.m. She was there for 12 minutes. 12 minutes is not a briefing. 12 minutes is a notification. The United States has just informed a vulnerable ally that the umbrella under which they have been sheltering may be about to develop a leak. The ambassador left through the loading dock, which is what you do when you do not want the cameras to see your face. There is a subtext here that the official readouts will not capture. It is the subtext of exhaustion. President Warner has been in office for 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days. She has aged visibly in that time. The gray at her temples has spread, unchecked by the attentions of the White House hairstylist. She sleeps 4 hours a night when she sleeps at all. She has read every casualty report from Ukraine, every intelligence assessment from the Middle East, every economic forecast warning of recession. She carries the weight of a world that seems determined to prove that diplomacy is a fool's errand. Tonight, in the Situation Room, she looked at the chairman and said, "Tell me again why they are doing this." The chairman did not have a new answer. Let's look at the Russian television coverage, because that is where the war of narratives is actually being fought. Russian state media is not covering the troop movements. They are covering something else entirely. They are running a documentary about the 1983 NATO exercise, Able Archer, a 10-day command post exercise that the Kremlin genuinely believed was cover for a nuclear first strike. The documentary is not subtle. It is arguing, in the urgent tones of a newsreader who knows she is being watched by censors, that the West has always harbored aggressive intentions, that the Soviet Union was right to be paranoid, that history is repeating itself. They are conditioning the Russian public for something. They are building the permission structure. In Washington, the pressure is now visibly leaking into the public domain. The pool reporters outside the West Wing have noticed the unusual number of staff cars. They have noticed that the National Security Advisor's deputy emerged at 8:47 p.m. to retrieve a folder from a courier, and that his face was pale. They have noticed that the White House press secretary, who usually bounds to the podium with practiced enthusiasm, walked past the briefing room without making eye contact. The correspondents are sending queries. The queries are being met with no comment. No comment in Washington is not an absence of information. It is information in itself. I need you to understand the temperature of the nuclear planning cells inside the Pentagon tonight. They are not panicking. Panic is a luxury reserved for civilians. The officers in the National Military Command Center are working methodically through checklists that were written decades before they were born. They are verifying communications links. They are updating target folders. They are running readiness drills that simulate the first 30 minutes of a conflict that, if it ever occurs, will render the next 30 minutes largely irrelevant. The fluorescent lights are too bright. The coffee is bad. The duty officers rotate every 12 hours, but nobody is rotating tonight. Nobody is leaving. The NATO Secretary General has convened the North Atlantic Council. This is the supreme political body of the alliance, the forum where ambassadors from 32 nations sit around a horseshoe-shaped table and negotiate the language of communiques. Tonight, there will be no communique. Tonight, the ambassadors are not negotiating language. They are being briefed in real time on the deployment of Russian nuclear-capable systems to Belarus. The Polish ambassador asked for clarification on Article 5 response timelines. The German ambassador asked for verification of the intelligence. The French ambassador said nothing, which is how you know the French ambassador is extremely concerned. We have to talk about the nuclear triad because it is the invisible scaffolding of this entire crisis. The triad, bombers, land-based missiles, submarine-launched missiles, was designed to ensure that no single enemy action could disarm the United States. Tonight, the triad is flexing. The bombers at Barksdale and Minot are being moved from alert hangars to the flight line. The missileers in their launch control centers, 300 feet underground on the high plains of Montana and North Dakota, have received a routine status check that was anything but routine. The ballistic missile submarines, the boomers, are silent by doctrine, but the communications traffic to their home ports in Kings Bay and Bangor has spiked. The triad is awake. Now we circle back to the letter. The letter is, in the end, about the difference between capability and intent. The Russians have the capability. The chairman's assessment is that they now have the intent or are rapidly developing it. But intent is not a fixed point. Intent can be deterred. Intent can be dissuaded. Intent can be reversed by a show of force that credibly threatens the aggressor with unacceptable costs. The chairman's fourth sentence, the one in plain English, is a recommendation. It is, I am told, that the president authorize an immediate, visible, and unambiguous demonstration of American nuclear readiness. Not a strike, a demonstration, the military equivalent of clearing the throat. President Warner has not yet acted on that recommendation. She is, instead, doing something that is not in any of the playbooks. She is writing a personal letter, not a diplomatic note, not a formal démarche, not a message delivered through the secure communications link between the White House and the Kremlin. A letter, handwritten, on her personal stationery. She is writing to a man she has never met. A man whose worldview is fundamentally alien to her. A man who sees the world as a series of zero-sum contests to be won or lost. She is writing to Vladimir Putin. She is telling him in words she is choosing carefully that the United States does not seek conflict, but that the United States will respond to any use of nuclear weapons with consequences that cannot be predicted or controlled. The letter will be delivered by the U.S. ambassador to Russia, who has been instructed to request an immediate meeting. The ambassador is currently en route from his residence to the Kremlin by car through streets that are slick with freezing rain. The Moscow traffic is, as always, nightmarish. The ambassador is not listening to music. He is rehearsing the words he will say, the tone he will strike, the balance between firmness and conciliation that might, just might, cause the man in the corner office to pause. That is the mission tonight. Not victory, not dominance. A pause, a breath, a moment to reconsider. And that, in the end, is where we are. We are in the pause. The engines are running on the tarmac at Offutt. The letters are being written on embossed stationery. The generals are reviewing the checklists. The diplomats are reaching for the phones. The world is holding its breath, waiting to see whether the pause stretches into resolution or shatters into flash. We will stay here through the night, if necessary, watching the shadows move behind the curtain windows of power. We will tell you what we see, what we can verify, what we can confirm. We will not speculate. We will not amplify rumor. We will simply bear witness to the long, slow, agonizing process of preventing the unthinkable. This is the last word for now. We will be back. We will always be back. Stay with us.